If you'd told me 2 years ago that I'd be sitting here recounting this story to a stranger, I wouldn't have believed you. But here I am, Laura, 65 years old, reflecting on choices I never thought I would make. Choices that changed everything I thought I knew about myself, my marriage, and the way I experienced desire. For most of my life, my husband, Robert, was the dominant one, the planner, the risk-taker. I followed his lead, trusting him completely. Together, we built a life, raised 2 children, retired early, and settled into what should have been the golden years. But when that golden security starts to rust, when unfulfilled desires begin to creep in, the world you thought was stable turns out to be a cage of your own making. That's where it all began. A suggestion so insane, so out of character, that I laughed when Robert first brought it up. I assumed it was a joke, but it wasn't. I'll never forget the night when Robert, sitting at the dinner table after yet another silent meal, made his shocking proposition. We'd long since given up trying to bridge the gap between us, our conversations hollow, filled only with the echoes of a marriage well past its prime, but this time he spoke with conviction. "I want you to, with someone else," he said, his eyes steady and distant. The words hit me like a thunderclap, reverberating in the space between us. I was stunned, not just by the suggestion itself, but by the sudden clarity in his voice. For the first time in years, there was fire in his eyes, a glint of something dark and consuming. I didn't want to ask, but the words slipped from my lips before I could stop them. "What do you mean?" He took a deep breath, his fingers tracing the rim of his wine glass. "I've thought about this a lot, Laura. I can't satisfy you anymore. You deserve better." There it was, the unspoken truth hanging in the air. Robert, nearly 80, no longer had the vitality he once did, and though we'd tiptoed around the subject for years, I had to admit that the thought had crossed my mind too. My body, still alive with its own desires, hadn't felt his touch in a meaningful way in longer than I cared to admit. But this suggestion was beyond anything I could have imagined. "I found someone," he continued, as if he'd been preparing for this conversation for weeks. "Well, 2 someones, David and Mark. They're young, successful, ready." I froze. 2? My husband had not just suggested I be with another man, but 2 young men. It was as if I had stepped into a dream, or more accurately, a nightmare. My stomach turned with a sick mix of fear and something else, something I hadn't felt in years. Curiosity. The days following Robert's confession were a blur. Life carried on as usual, but underneath I felt as though the ground had shifted beneath my feet. I went through the motions of everyday life, cleaning, gardening, making small talk with the neighbors, all while trying to ignore the growing knot in my stomach. Every glance Robert cast in my direction felt loaded, as if he were waiting for me to bring it up, to take him up on his insane offer. Weeks passed, and when the subject wasn't mentioned again, I began to relax. Perhaps it was a passing whim, a fantasy he'd entertained momentarily before realizing how absurd it was. But then one night as I was folding laundry, Robert approached me again. He stood at the doorway, hands in his pockets, his voice calm and unshaken. "I've set it up." I blinked, confused. "Set what up?" "David and Mark. They're expecting us this weekend. I thought we'd meet them for drinks, see how you feel." The blood drained from my face as the reality of his words sunk in. He was serious. Dead serious. "Robert, are you out of your mind?" I said, my voice trembling. But even as I protested, I couldn't shake the flicker of something inside me. My mind conjured images I wasn't ready to admit to. I felt the heat rise in my chest, the fear, the excitement, all twisted together into something that both terrified and thrilled me. "They know the situation. "They're willing, Laura," he said softly, as if he were doing me a favor. I stared at him, unable to find the words to explain the war going on inside me. But Robert, being Robert, had already decided for us both. "We leave Saturday." The weekend arrived all too soon. Robert had reserved a table at a sleek hotel lounge in the city, a place far enough from home to ensure we wouldn't run into anyone we knew. As we walked into the bar, I felt out of place in my elegant dress, my hand clutching my purse as though it could anchor me in the storm brewing inside me. I was nervous, beyond nervous, but Robert remained calm, guiding me toward a corner table where David and Mark were already waiting. My heart nearly stopped when I saw them. David, 25, had a clean-cut, sharp look to him. A tailored suit hugged his broad shoulders, his dark hair swept neatly back. Mark, a little older at 27, was the opposite. He exuded a casual confidence, his brown curls tousled and his smile easy and charming. Both were strikingly handsome, and for a moment I felt like I was intruding on someone else's life. Robert introduced us, his voice unnervingly steady, and I shook hands with the two men, my own hand trembling slightly as I did so. David's grip was firm but respectful, while Mark flashed me a grin that made my stomach flip. "It's nice to meet you, Laura," David said, his deep voice resonating as he looked directly into my eyes. "Likewise," I managed to reply, though my voice came out quieter than I'd intended. The four of us sat down, the conversation light at first. Polite introductions, harmless small talk. But there was a charged undercurrent I couldn't ignore, a tension that hummed beneath the surface of every word. Mark, the more playful of the two, was quick to tease, making jokes and keeping the mood casual. I appreciated his attempt to lighten the atmosphere, though it only made me more aware of the heavy expectations weighing down on me. Meanwhile, David remained steady, his gaze often drifting toward me with a quiet intensity that made me feel exposed. "Should we move this upstairs?" Robert's voice cut through the air, calm and authoritative. My heart stopped. The two men exchanged a glance before turning their attention to me. Robert looked at me expectantly, waiting for my answer. I felt trapped like a deer caught in headlights, but there was no turning back now. Nodding weakly, I followed them to the elevator, my mind racing. The hotel room was spacious, minimalistic, with a panoramic view of the city lights. My body felt numb as I stepped inside, my pulse racing in my ears. The room seemed to close in around me as the door shut behind us, the air thick with anticipation. Robert stood by the window, pouring drinks as if this were a perfectly normal evening. My mouth was dry, my heart hammering in my chest as David and Mark stepped closer, their presence commanding and overwhelming. I could feel their youth and vitality radiating off them, and suddenly I was acutely aware of my age, of my body, of the years that had passed since anyone had looked at me like this. "Laura," David's voice was soft but firm, his eyes locking with mine. "Are you okay?" I swallowed hard, forcing myself to nod. I wasn't okay. I was terrified. But beneath the fear, there was a flicker of something else, desire, long buried and now awakened by the sheer audacity of the situation. Robert handed me a glass of wine, his hand brushing mine briefly. I looked at him, searching his face for some sign of hesitation, some acknowledgement that this was madness. But all I saw was calm, cold, calculating calm. David stepped closer, his hand resting lightly on my waist. His touch was warm, steady, and for a moment I felt myself relax. Mark joined him, standing on my other side, his smile softening as he placed a gentle hand on my arm. I closed my eyes, letting myself breathe, letting their touch ground me. "We'll go slow," David murmured, his voice reassuring. I opened my eyes, meeting his gaze. There was no rush, no pressure, just patience, as if he understood the enormity of what I was stepping into. And then, for the first time in what felt like years, I let go. What followed was a blur of sensation, of hands, lips, and skin. David's touch was steady, controlled, guiding me with a gentle firmness that made me feel safe, even as I ventured into the unknown. Mark, on the other hand, was more playful, teasing me with light caresses, his laughter breaking through the tension in moments where I thought I might lose myself to fear. Their youth, their vitality, it all crashed over me like a wave, drowning out the doubt and hesitation that had plagued me for weeks. In their arms, I felt a resurgence of something I hadn't even realized I'd lost, a sense of being seen, of being desired in a way that went beyond mere physicality. For the first time in years, I felt alive, truly alive. Robert watched from a distance, silent and still, his eyes fixed on me as I succumbed to the flood of sensations. I caught his gaze once, briefly, and in that moment I saw something I hadn't expected. Satisfaction. He had gotten what he wanted. This was his fantasy, his creation, and now he was watching it unfold with an almost clinical detachment. I had stepped over the edge. There was no going back. The next morning, the weight of what had happened settled over me like a heavy fog. I woke up alone in bed, the room eerily quiet, the sunlight streaming in through the large windows. The events of the night before felt like a dream, disjointed, surreal, but the soreness in my body was a reminder that it had been all too real. I could hear voices in the other room, Robert, David, and Mark, talking in low tones. I lay there for a while, listening to the quiet murmur of their conversation, trying to process what had happened. I felt detached, like I was floating just above the surface of reality, unable to fully grasp the implications of what I'd done. Eventually, I gathered the courage to get up, slipping into a robe as I padded into the other room. Robert was sitting at the table, a cup of coffee in hand, while David and Mark were standing by the window, their expressions calm, almost businesslike. "Good morning," Robert said, glancing up at me. "Morning," I replied quietly, my voice hoarse. David and Mark turned to me, their faces unreadable. Mark smiled softly, offering me a cup of coffee, but there was a distance in his eyes that hadn't been there the night before. It was as if a switch had been flipped, and now we were back to being strangers. I sipped my coffee in silence, the weight of their presence pressing down on me. I wanted to say something, to break the awkward tension, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, David broke the silence. "We should get going," he said, glancing at Mark. "It was nice meeting you, Laura." I nodded, unable to find my voice. Mark gave me a quick hug, his touch light and fleeting, before they both made their way to the door. And then they were gone. The door clicked shut, leaving me alone with Robert. I turned to him, waiting for him to say something, anything, that would make sense of what had just happened, but he didn't. He simply stood up, drained the last of his coffee, and walked past me without a word. I was left standing there, the cold reality of the situation sinking in. I had crossed a line I never thought I would cross, and now there was no way to undo it. In the days that followed, Robert barely mentioned what had happened. Life returned to its usual rhythm, breakfasts in silence, afternoons spent tending to the garden, evenings in front of the television. But there was an unspoken tension between us, a heaviness that lingered in the air. I couldn't stop thinking about David and Mark, their touch, their gaze, the way they had made me feel. It wasn't just the physical pleasure that haunted me, though that had been undeniable. It was the way they had seen me, the way they had made me feel desirable in a way Robert hadn't in years. I had expected to feel guilty, to regret what I had done, but the truth was I didn't. Instead, I felt conflicted. torn between the life I had always known and the new world of desire I had stumbled into. It didn't take long for Robert to bring it up again. One evening, as we were sitting in the living room, he casually mentioned the idea of meeting with David and Mark again. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone light. "Maybe we should do it again." I stared at him, my heart sinking. "What do you mean?" "David and Mark," he replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Or maybe someone else this time. There are plenty of options." I felt a wave of nausea rise in my chest. "Robert, I don't think—" "Come on, Laura," he interrupted, his voice sharpening. "Don't tell me you didn't enjoy it. I saw the way you reacted." I flinched at his words, my stomach twisting. "It's not that simple," I whispered. He leaned forward, his eyes darkening. "It is that simple. You want it. I know you do." I shook my head, feeling the tears well up behind my eyes. "No, Robert, I don't want this." But even as I said the words, I wasn't entirely sure I believed them. Despite my protests, Robert didn't let up. His obsession with the idea of sharing me with other men grew stronger, and soon it became clear that this wasn't just a fleeting fantasy. It was something darker, something I hadn't anticipated. One night, after yet another argument about it, I snapped. "I'm done, Robert," I said, my voice shaking. "I can't do this any more." He stared at me, disbelief clouding his eyes. "What are you talking about?" "This," I said, gesturing between us. "I can't keep pretending this is normal. I can't keep being someone I'm not." For a long moment there was silence. Then Robert's face twisted with anger. "You're ungrateful," he spat. "After everything I've done for you." "Everything you've done for me?" I cut him off, my voice rising. "This wasn't for me, Robert. This was for you, your fantasy, your desires." His eyes flashed with fury, but I didn't back down. "I don't want this," I said quietly. "I never did." He stared at me, his jaw clenched, before storming out of the room, leaving me alone in the deafening silence. The weeks that followed were a blur of emotional turmoil. Robert and I barely spoke, the tension between us growing unbearable. I tried to throw myself into other things, visiting friends, volunteering at the local library, but nothing could drown out the growing realization that my marriage was falling apart. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner, Robert finally spoke. "I'm leaving," he said, his voice hollow. I looked up, shocked. "What?" "I can't do this anymore, Laura," he said, his eyes filled with exhaustion. "We're not the same people we used to be. This isn't working." I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me, mixed with sadness. It was true. We weren't the same people we had once been, and maybe it was time to finally admit that. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I never wanted it to come to this. Neither of us did. But sometimes things fall apart, and all you can do is pick up the pieces and move on." In the months that followed, I found myself in uncharted territory, alone for the first time in decades, trying to rebuild a life that had been centered around my marriage for so long. It wasn't easy. There were days when the loneliness felt unbearable, when I missed Robert despite everything. But there were also moments of clarity, moments when I realized that I was finally free to figure out who I was, outside of the roles I had played for so long. Slowly, I began to rediscover myself. I took up painting again, something I hadn't done since my 20s. I traveled, visited friends, and even flirted with the idea of dating again. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a new beginning waiting for me.
The water glistened with muted reflections as dusk wrapped Venice in its silken shroud. I leaned over the ancient stone balcony of our rented villa, watching the canals twist into shadows. Far below, the murmur of gondoliers mingled with the faint clinking of glasses from a distant restaurant, blending into the city's eternal lullaby. It felt almost cinematic, this setting, as if I'd slipped into someone else's story. Daniel, my husband, had insisted on Venice, a grand idea to pull our family together, he'd said, a bonding experience. But I could sense the irony even before we arrived. Venice was a city of mysteries and veiled secrets, not exactly the sort of place to stitch a family into a single happy unit. Perhaps that was why I felt restless, my gaze drawn too often to the young man with stormy eyes who lingered near the corners of rooms, watching with a smirk that suggested he saw through everything. Philip, my stepson, carried himself like he owned his secrets, wearing them like a second skin. He was more elusive than I remembered, as if the years apart had only deepened the distance between us. Yet his rare glances my way held an intensity that felt oddly personal, almost like an accusation, though I couldn't place why. It was in Venice, in the hazy glow of twilight and under the mask of normalcy, that I first noticed the fissures, those invisible cracks running beneath us, growing sharper and more obvious with each passing day. I should have known better than to follow him that night, should have resisted the pull of my curiosity. But something about the way he slipped from the room, quietly, as if hoping not to be noticed, stirred a part of me I hadn't felt in years. I could tell myself it was worry, the desire to keep peace between him and his father. But it was more complicated than that. I sensed there was a shadow between us, something unsaid, something that begged to be explored. Down the alleyways I followed, watching him weave through the crowds with a practiced ease that only stirred my curiosity further. And then he disappeared into a narrow passage where the only light came from a single street lamp casting an orange hue. I hung back, trying to look casual, blending in with the tourists strolling past. It was then that I saw it, the exchange, subtle but unmistakable. Philip was meeting someone, a tall figure shrouded in black, who handed him something before disappearing into the shadows. My heart raced. What was he hiding? And why had he come all the way to Venice to keep his secrets? In the days that followed, my suspicions grew. Yet I couldn't help the magnetic pull I felt each time he was near. Philip had that rare quality of making me question everything I thought I understood. About him, about Daniel, and perhaps most unsettlingly, about myself. And Venice, with its endless corners and hidden alleys, only deepened the sense of being trapped in a web of secrecy, one I was both fearful and desperate to unravel. It was a choice I'd made that night to follow him, but it was a choice that would lead to far darker revelations than I ever could have anticipated. Looking back, it's strange to think about how naturally I took on the role of Elaine Marcotte, the sophisticated second wife of a tech mogul. I was the poised woman by Daniel's side, the one who organized charity galas, arranged dinner parties, and made the small talk he never cared for. I'd spent years curating a life that, by all appearances, seemed flawless. And for the most part it was. But Daniel was a complex man. His career had always come first, pulling him from one city to another in pursuit of the next big innovation, leaving me with the time and resources to mold our home into an elegant, if empty, sanctuary. Our marriage was the sort that existed in public gestures, in shared photos at events, and in the subtle, respectable silence of routine. I told myself this was what I wanted, that I could live with Daniel's distance, with the knowledge that he gave more to his work than he'd ever given to me. After all, we both understood our roles. And then there was Philip, Daniel's son from his first marriage. Philip had been a fixture in my life since he was a teenager, though we'd had little more than cordial interactions in those years. While I organized his father's life, he went about building his own. a life that seemed to exist on the fringes, cloaked in mystery. It was hard to get close to him. He was always the quiet, rebellious one, drifting in and out of our lives with a cold, almost calculating detachment. As a journalist, he'd taken on the sort of dangerous assignments that seemed crafted to keep him as far from his father as possible. Conflict zones, stories of political corruption, dark investigations that led him to places where others wouldn't go. It suited him somehow. Philip had an intensity that came with understanding things most people avoided, and it showed in the way he interacted with the world around him. Carefully, almost cautiously, like someone accustomed to secrets. The invitation to Venice had been Daniel's idea. He thought it would be a chance to reconnect, as he put it, a word that felt hollow even as he said it. But he was sincere in his way. Daniel liked the idea of family, even if he didn't fully understand what it meant. And so we went along with it, and Venice became the backdrop for our uneasy reunion. From the start, Philip's demeanor was more guarded than ever, his presence unsettling in ways I couldn't quite articulate. There was a quiet rebellion in his eyes when he looked at his father, a tension simmering just below the surface. I told myself it was only natural. Families are complicated after all. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than that. One evening, as we sat by the balcony with glasses of wine, I caught Philip's gaze resting on me for just a moment too long. It was subtle, but unmistakable, that lingering look that made my pulse quicken for reasons I couldn't fully explain. In the soft glow of Venetian lights, I felt oddly vulnerable, as though he saw past the polite mask I wore. It left me wondering how much he really understood. About me, about his father, perhaps even about the life I'd crafted so carefully. Daniel, ever distracted by his phone and emails, barely noticed the tension that hung in the air. He had a talent for missing things that mattered, like the way Philip's eyes narrowed whenever he spoke about their shared past, or the bitterness that crept into his tone during strained conversations. If Daniel sensed the resentment his son harbored, he chose to ignore it, likely out of convenience. He was a man who thrived on pragmatism, after all. And in that pragmatism I found the seeds of my own loneliness. It was one afternoon that week, when Daniel left for a quick business meeting, that I found myself alone with Philip in the villa's airy salon. I'd been flipping through an old travel guide, trying to decide on an itinerary, when Philip appeared at the doorway, his gaze as sharp as ever. "Venice is a maze," he said, a smirk playing at his lips. "Easy to get lost if you're not careful." I looked up, startled by his presence, though I tried to mask my surprise. "Well, that's part of the charm, isn't it?" I replied lightly, though his words had stirred something in me. An image of myself wandering through narrow alleys, seeking something I couldn't quite define. Philip stepped further into the room, taking a seat across from me. "Do you ever feel like you're searching for something? That's what I love about this city. It doesn't give up its secrets easily." His gaze held mine, and for a brief, unsettling moment I felt exposed, as if he saw the things I tried to hide. The quiet dissatisfaction, the restlessness. He leaned back, eyes gleaming with something I couldn't place, and suddenly the room felt too small, the air too close. I tried to laugh, to brush off the strange tension that crackled between us. "I suppose we're all searching for something in our own way," I said, my voice softer than I intended. He chuckled, a dark, knowing sound that left me feeling as though I'd revealed too much. "Maybe some of us aren't searching. Maybe we already know what we want." With those words, he rose, leaving me to grapple with the strange pull I felt whenever he was near. The sensation was disorienting, filling me with a mix of intrigue and unease. I had always prided myself on control, on my ability to shape my life exactly as I wanted. But here, in this city of shadows and secrets, I felt as if that control was slipping through my fingers. As the days wore on, I found myself drawn to Philip in ways I couldn't explain, a fascination that felt both dangerous and alluring. It wasn't love, I told myself. It couldn't be. It was only the allure of the forbidden, the thrill of his silent defiance, a reflection of the parts of myself I'd kept buried. But it was in Venice, under the weight of unspoken words and glances that lingered a little too long, that I began to realize I wasn't in control of anything. Not really. I was only beginning to scratch the surface of the secrets between us. And yet, something in me longed to dive deeper, to unravel the threads connecting us, even as I feared where they might lead. In the days that followed, I would come to regret that curiosity. Over the next few days, our time in Venice took on a rhythm, but it was one that didn't quite fit. Mornings began with grand plans. Museums, historical tours, sampling Venetian delicacies at small cafes tucked between narrow streets. But by afternoon, the plan would unravel, with Daniel getting pulled into calls, emails, or some emergency that required his attention. He'd disappear into the study with his laptop, leaving Philip and me to drift through the city on our own. I told myself these moments alone with Philip were innocent, harmless even. But there was an undeniable tension between us, like an electric current humming beneath the surface, growing with each glance, each casual brush of his hand as we passed through the tight alleys. I couldn't understand why this young man, whose life I'd been a part of for years, now seemed to have a hold over me, casting shadows of doubt and temptation that I struggled to ignore. One afternoon, we found ourselves at the Gallery dell'Accademia. The heat had been intense, and the galleries were quiet, nearly deserted. We wandered slowly, our footsteps echoing through the vaulted rooms. Philip stopped in front of a Renaissance painting, his expression unreadable. "There's a darkness to these paintings," he said, his voice low, as though speaking to himself. "The artists poured everything into them, their fears, their desires. Things they could never say out loud." I glanced at him, feeling a shiver at his words. He wasn't looking at the painting but at me, his gaze penetrating, as if he were peeling back the layers I hid behind. His words hung in the air, echoing around us, and I found myself at a loss, unable to meet his gaze for more than a moment. "What about you?" I asked, a bit too quickly, hoping to deflect. "Do you have fears, Philip? Things you keep hidden?" His smile was fleeting, almost bitter. "We all do, don't we?" The answer felt like a deflection, but I didn't push. There was something unsettling about the look in his eyes, a hint of something I couldn't quite name. We continued through the gallery, but his words lingered with me, pulling at the threads of my own carefully guarded secrets. Perhaps he sensed that, sensed my hesitation, my restlessness. After the museum, we walked along the canal, the sun casting long shadows on the stone walls around us. He was quiet, contemplative, and I found myself watching him from the corner of my eye, wondering what he was hiding behind that smirk, that calculated coolness. Then, just as we were about to turn back, I noticed something odd. Philip paused at a small nondescript bridge, glancing around before casually leaning against the railing. From my angle, I could see him reach into his pocket and pull out a slip of paper, glancing at it before tucking it back with an air of secrecy. His eyes darted, scanning the crowd as though he was searching for someone. "Who are you looking for?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light, though my heart thudded with a strange thrill. He didn't answer at first, as if weighing whether to share the truth or brush me off. Finally, he shrugged. "An old friend. Someone I knew back when I was covering stories in Europe. He's involved in some things here." His answer was vague, leaving much to interpretation, and it only served to deepen the curiosity that had been growing in me. Was this friend the man I'd seen him meeting in the alley that first night? And if so, what business did Philip have with him? We returned to the villa in near silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. But as we crossed the threshold into the cool, dimly lit interior, I felt a flicker of regret. There was a line here, one I knew better than to cross, and yet the mystery surrounding him, the secrets he held, were drawing me in with a force I hadn't anticipated. That evening, Daniel suggested a group dinner at a nearby trattoria, a charming little spot overlooking the Grand Canal. I spent most of the meal listening to him talk about his latest projects, the new software his team was developing, the potential for future acquisitions. Philip seemed disengaged, offering only the occasional nod or perfunctory comment, his gaze often drifting to the canal outside, where boats drifted by in the fading light. At one point, Daniel excused himself to take a call, leaving us alone at the table. I sipped my wine, feeling the weight of the silence between us, a silence that felt as though it were filled with unspoken words, questions that neither of us dared voice. After a while, Philip turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if things had been different? If you hadn't married my father?" The question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. I could feel his gaze on me, intense, almost challenging, as though daring me to reveal something, anything. "I don't think about it," I said, though the answer sounded hollow, even to my own ears. "We make choices, and we live with them." He laughed softly, a bitter sound. "That's the difference between us, I suppose. I don't believe in accepting things as they are." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. For the first time, I wondered what had truly brought him to Venice. Was it really just a family vacation? Or did he have other reasons, hidden motives that he was keeping from us? That night, unable to sleep, I wandered through the villa's dimly lit corridors, eventually finding my way to the library. It was a beautiful room, filled with antique books and heavy leather armchairs, a testament to the villa's storied past. As I browsed the shelves, I heard a faint sound from down the hall, a whisper of movement. My heart quickened, and I moved toward the doorway, peeking out just in time to see Philip slipping out of his room, his figure shrouded in shadows as he headed down the staircase. I hesitated, the rational part of me warning that it was none of my business, that whatever he was doing was his own affair. But curiosity and something else, something I couldn't quite name, spurred me to follow. I trailed him through the villa and out onto the canal, careful to keep my distance. We wound through Venice's labyrinthine streets, my footsteps echoing quietly in the empty alleyways. Eventually, he stopped near a bridge, leaning against the railing, waiting. I hung back in the shadows, watching as he scanned the deserted streets, his posture tense, alert. After a few minutes, a figure approached. A man I didn't recognize, tall and dressed in dark clothing. They spoke in hushed tones, their words too quiet for me to make out. But the tension in their exchange was clear, and when Philip handed the man a small package, I felt a chill run through me. What was he involved in? The possibilities raced through my mind, each one darker than the last. I should have turned back, returned to the villa, and pretended I hadn't seen anything. But something compelled me to stay, a morbid curiosity, a desire to understand the secrets he was so carefully guarding. When the exchange was over, Philip watched the man disappear into the night before he began to make his way back toward the villa. I ducked into the shadows, holding my breath as he passed, my heart pounding in my chest. Back in the safety of my room, I lay awake, my mind racing with questions. Who was the man? What was in the package? And why was Philip meeting him in the dead of night, in a foreign city far from the reach of his father's influence? The days that followed only deepened the mystery. Philip continued to disappear at odd hours, always returning with that same air of secrecy, that same smirk that suggested he knew more than he let on. And each time he looked at me, I felt the pull between us grow stronger. A magnetic force that defied reason, that made me question everything I thought I knew. It was then that I realized I was no longer just a bystander in his life, a mere observer to his secrets. I was entangled in them, caught in a web of intrigue and danger that I hadn't anticipated. And as much as I wanted to believe I could walk away, I knew that it was far too late for that. In Venice, secrets weren't meant to stay hidden. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever Philip was hiding, it was only the beginning, that there were darker truths lying just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. The days after that clandestine night passed in an uneasy blur. By daylight, Venice sparkled, its canals glittering and its buildings golden in the sun's warmth. I tried to lose myself in the city's charm, convincing myself that my curiosity was nothing more than idle distraction. But the memory of Philip in the shadows, exchanging a package with that mysterious figure, clung to me like a shadow, yet I couldn't ask him directly. Daniel was still blissfully unaware, engrossed in business calls, emails, and plans for future projects. He didn't seem to notice the quiet tension between Philip and me, the way his son's gaze lingered a second too long, or the unspoken exchanges that sparked whenever we were alone. Each time Daniel left the room, I felt as though I were stepping into a different world. One where Philip and I shared something dark and unspoken, a secret that was drawing me in despite every warning voice in my head. One afternoon, after Daniel headed off to meet an old colleague in a nearby town, I was left alone in the villa once again. I heard movement down the hall and found Philip in the study, sorting through papers and documents in an oddly purposeful way. His expression was tense, as though he were looking for something specific. "What are you doing?" I asked, feigning casualness, though my heart raced at the thought of uncovering whatever secret he might be hiding. He looked up, a flicker of surprise crossing his face, followed by that familiar, guarded smirk. "Just some research," he replied smoothly, his tone betraying nothing. "I'm working on an article, trying to piece some things together." I nodded, though my instincts told me he wasn't being entirely honest. Something about the way he moved, the tension in his shoulders, hinted at something deeper, something that had nothing to do with journalism. "Does this research have anything to do with the man I saw you with last night?" I asked, unable to hold back. The words left my mouth before I had time to reconsider, and I felt my pulse quicken at the realization that I'd confronted him so directly. Philip's expression didn't waver, but I saw a brief flicker of something in his eyes. Annoyance, perhaps, or surprise. "You were following me?" "I happened to see you," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. "I was curious. You don't strike me as the type to take midnight strolls with strangers." For a moment he held my gaze, an intensity sparking in his eyes that sent a thrill through me, a thrill that felt dangerously close to fear. "Maybe you don't know me as well as you think, Elaine." I took a steadying breath, refusing to back down. "Perhaps not. But you're my stepson, Philip. If you're involved in something dangerous, I think I have a right to know." He laughed softly, the sound dark and cynical. "Dangerous? I wouldn't say that. But let's just say, I have my reasons for being here. Reasons that have nothing to do with bonding with my father." He turned away, as if dismissing the conversation, and I watched him with a mixture of frustration and intrigue. I could feel myself being drawn in, the mystery surrounding him deepening with every evasive answer, every deflection. It was as though he were daring me to pursue the truth, to dig deeper. And despite every logical warning in my head, I found myself wanting to do exactly that. That evening, after Philip had left the villa again, I found myself pacing the hallway outside his room, torn between the desire to know the truth and the fear of what I might uncover. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob, before finally pushing the door open. His room was neatly organized, almost too much so. There were no personal items on display, no signs of the man I thought I'd known. But on the desk, I noticed a stack of papers. The top one marked with my husband's name. My heart raced as I scanned the page. It was a legal document, A trust agreement with Daniel's name listed as the primary beneficiary. I didn't know the specifics, but one thing was clear. Whatever Philip was doing here had something to do with his father's finances. I heard footsteps in the hallway, and my pulse quickened. Quickly, I slipped the papers back in place and moved to the window, pretending to admire the view as Philip entered. He paused, looking at me with an unreadable expression. "What are you doing in here?" he asked, his tone cool, though I sensed a note of suspicion. "I was just admiring the view," I replied lightly, trying to mask the tension in my voice. "Venice is beautiful at night." He stepped closer, his eyes searching mine with an intensity that made me feel as though he could see right through me. "Beautiful, but deceptive. Venice is full of shadows, secrets hiding just beneath the surface." I held his gaze, feeling a strange thrill at his words, a thrill that was both exhilarating and unnerving. "Is that why you're here, Philip? To uncover those secrets?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe I am. Or maybe I'm just here to find out the truth." The words hung between us, heavy with implication, and I felt a pang of unease. I realized then that Philip wasn't just searching for something hidden in Venice. He was searching for something about his father, something that he believed had been kept from him. And somehow, I had become entangled in that search, a player in a game I didn't fully understand. The next day, Daniel announced that he had an urgent call with his board of directors and would need to spend the afternoon at the villa, leaving Philip and me to explore the city on our own. He handed me a credit card with a wink, encouraging us to enjoy ourselves, and disappeared into his study, already engrossed in his work. Philip suggested we take a Vaporetto ride along the Grand Canal, and despite the knot of tension in my chest, I agreed. The afternoon was warm, the sunlight casting a golden glow over the water as we drifted past palaces and churches, their reflections shimmering in the canal. As we reached a quieter part of the city, Philip motioned for me to follow him off the boat and down a narrow alleyway that led to a small, secluded bridge. I hesitated, sensing that we were venturing into territory that felt dangerous, both physically and emotionally. But the curiosity burning inside me was stronger than the fear, and I followed him. He leaned against the bridge railing, gazing out over the water with a distant look in his eyes. "Do you ever wonder if there are things you don't know about Daniel?" he asked suddenly, his voice low, almost a whisper. The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "I mean, have you ever felt like he was hiding something from you? Something important?" I hesitated, a flicker of doubt creeping into my mind. Daniel was distant, yes, and he often kept his work life separate from our marriage. But secrets? I hadn't considered it before. And yet, now that Philip mentioned it, I couldn't help but wonder if there was more to my husband than I knew. "What are you getting at, Philip?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He sighed, glancing away. "Nothing. Just thinking out loud, I suppose." But I knew he wasn't just thinking out loud. There was something he wasn't telling me, something that weighed on him heavily, and I felt a surge of frustration at his evasiveness. "You can trust me, you know?" I said softly, surprising myself with the intensity of my own words. "If there's something you're involved in, something that concerns Daniel, I want to understand." For a moment, he looked at me with a strange, almost vulnerable expression, as though he were torn between the desire to confide in me and the instinct to keep his secrets close. But then he smiled, a guarded, cynical smile that made my heart ache with disappointment. "Trust is a dangerous thing," he said, his tone tinged with bitterness, "and in my experience, it's rarely worth the risk." He straightened, turning to walk back toward the main canal, and I watched him go, feeling a mixture of frustration and intrigue. Philip was a puzzle, one I was desperate to solve, even as I sensed the danger in becoming too entangled in his secrets. That evening, I couldn't shake the sense that I was missing something important, something hidden just out of reach. I found myself returning to Philip's room while he was out, driven by a need to understand whatever game he was playing. This time I didn't hold back, searching through his belongings with a determination that bordered on desperation. In the bottom drawer of his desk, I found a folder filled with documents, receipts, and photos. My hands trembled as I sifted through them, piecing together fragments of a puzzle that was far more complex than I'd anticipated. There were bank statements, transactions made to offshore accounts, and legal papers. Documents that suggested Philip had been investigating his father's finances for months, if not years. But it was the photographs that stopped me cold. They were photos of Daniel, taken from a distance, as though he were being followed. And then, at the very bottom of the stack, was a photo of me, taken in the villa, unaware that I was being watched. A chill ran down my spine as I stared at the image, realizing with dawning horror that Philip had been watching us, observing us, perhaps even plotting something I couldn't begin to understand. Footsteps echoed down the hall, and I hurriedly shoved the documents back into the drawer, my heart racing as I returned to my room, trying to compose myself. But the sense of dread lingered, growing with each passing moment. I'd thought I was uncovering Philip's secrets, but now I realized that he was uncovering ours, secrets that I hadn't even known existed. Secrets that could destroy us all. And as much as I wanted to walk away, to forget the things I'd seen, I knew that it was far too late for that. The villa felt colder that evening, shadows stretching long across the walls as I sat alone, the documents I'd found still fresh in my mind. Each photograph, each document, pointed to something I could no longer ignore. Philip was conducting his own investigation, a meticulous one that involved Daniel, and somehow me. My hands still shook as I remembered the photograph of myself, taken with the same cold detachment that marked Philip's demeanor. He'd been watching us, watching me. But why? And for how long? When Philip finally returned, I was waiting for him in the dimly lit library, the place where our paths so often crossed, the quiet room where I always felt his unspoken words hover around us, thickening the air. He paused when he saw me, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before he masked it with that familiar, infuriating smirk. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his tone casual, almost amused. "No," I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. "I thought we might talk." He regarded me with an unreadable expression, then stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. There was a dangerous calm in his demeanor, a quiet intensity that made my heart race despite myself. He took a seat across from me, folding his hands neatly as though preparing for a business meeting. "What would you like to discuss, Elaine?" he asked, his gaze unwavering, challenging. For a moment I was at a loss for words. How did one accuse someone of spying on their own family, of plotting something that defied understanding? But I forced myself to stay calm, to keep my emotions in check. I couldn't afford to let him see the fear in my eyes. "I found something," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "In your room. Documents, photographs, evidence that you've been watching Daniel and me, and I want to know why." Philip's expression didn't change, but I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps amusement or satisfaction. "You've been searching through my things?" he asked, his tone casual, almost teasing. "Yes," I replied, refusing to back down. "I had to. You've been hiding things, keeping secrets that involve my husband, and I deserve to know what they are." He leaned back, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I'm impressed, Elaine. I didn't think you had it in you to pry. You've always seemed so careful, so content with your role, but here you are, breaking into my room, demanding answers." "Stop it, Philip," I said sharply, feeling my anger rise. "Just tell me the truth. What are you planning? And what does it have to do with Daniel?" He regarded me for a moment, then let out a soft sigh, as though he were finally dropping a facade he'd worn for too long. "Fine," he said, his voice taking on a cold, hard edge. You want the truth? Daniel isn't the man you think he is. He's built his entire empire on lies, on deceit, and I intend to bring it all down. The words hung in the air, stark and unyielding. I stared at him, stunned, trying to process the enormity of what he'd just said. What are you talking about? Your husband, he continued, his tone mocking, has spent years building his fortune through underhanded deals, through partnerships with people who operate in the shadows. Offshore accounts, hidden transactions, bribery. It's all there if you know where to look. He's made millions exploiting loopholes, using people, stepping on those who trusted him. I shook my head, unwilling to believe it. That's ridiculous. Daniel may be distant, but he's not a criminal. Oh, he's careful, I'll give him that, Philip said, his eyes narrowing. He's built his life so perfectly that you'd never suspect a thing. But I have proof. Every shady deal, every under-the-table payment. It's all there. He paused, watching me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I realized that this wasn't just a family feud. Philip wasn't here to simply confront his father. He was here to destroy him. Why? I asked, my voice trembling. Why would you want to do this? He's your father. Is he? Philip's voice was cold, unfeeling. He left my mother when I was a child, left us to fend for ourselves while he built his empire. He ignored us, pretended we didn't exist. He cared more about his reputation than he ever cared about me. And now, I have the chance to make him pay for everything he's done. I stared at him, feeling a wave of conflicting emotions, anger, fear, and strangely, a flicker of understanding. I knew what it was like to live with someone who kept secrets, who withheld affection in favor of success and power. But this was something else, something darker. And what about me? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Where do I fit into this? He leaned closer, his gaze intense. You're a pawn, Elaine, an innocent bystander caught in the crossfire, but if you play your part right, you might come out of this unscathed. His words hit me like a slap, and I felt a surge of indignation. A pawn? You think you can just use me in your twisted game? Philip shrugged, unbothered. Everyone is a pawn in someone's game. You can either play along or get out of the way. The room fell into a tense silence, the weight of his words settling over me like a shroud. I realized then that I was in far deeper than I'd thought, that I'd allowed myself to be drawn into a game I didn't fully understand. And yet, despite the danger, despite the growing sense of dread, I felt a strange exhilaration. This was a part of my life I'd never dared explore, a part of me that yearned for something darker, something more than the carefully constructed image I'd spent years maintaining. But this wasn't just a thrill, it was a risk. And as much as I wanted to confront Daniel, to demand answers, I knew that doing so would only put me in greater danger. Over the next few days, I tried to act as though everything were normal, though every moment with Daniel felt tinged with suspicion. His easy smile, his absent-minded kisses, the way he seemed so thoroughly engrossed in his work, it all felt like a mask, one that I was now desperate to tear away. One evening, as we sat by the fireplace, I gathered the courage to ask him a question that had been haunting me. Daniel, have you ever done something you regret in business? He looked at me, surprised, then laughed softly. Regret? No, I've been lucky in my career. I've made some difficult decisions, of course, but nothing I would change. Are you sure? I pressed, trying to keep my voice casual, though my heart raced. No partnerships you wish you hadn't entered into? He paused, a flicker of something, annoyance maybe, crossing his face. Elaine, what's this about? I thought we were on vacation. Are you really interested in my work now? I forced a smile, but inside, my suspicions only grew. He was deflecting, avoiding the question with practiced ease. And I realized with a sinking feeling that Philip's accusations might be true. That night, as I lay awake beside Daniel, I found myself staring at the ceiling, wondering how I'd ended up here, trapped between two men who seemed to wield secrets like weapons. I thought of Philip, of the cold determination in his eyes, of the way he seemed to revel in the knowledge he held. I thought of Daniel, of the life he'd built on foundations I was no longer sure I understood. And I realized that I couldn't continue living in the shadows of their lies. If I was to understand the truth, I would need to take matters into my own hands. The next day, I asked Daniel if we could explore the city together, hoping for a moment alone to confront him about the things I'd discovered. We wandered through Venice, drifting through the crowded streets and narrow alleys, until we found a quiet corner near the edge of the canal. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "Daniel, I need to ask you something serious." He looked at me, his expression softening. "What is it?" "Are you hiding something from me?" I asked, forcing the words out. "Something that could ruin us?" His face tightened, and I saw a flicker of anger in his eyes. "Elaine, what are you talking about?" "Philip," I said, the name leaving my lips before I could stop it. "He's been watching you, investigating your business dealings. He claims you've been involved in illegal transactions, that your empire is built on lies." Daniel's expression turned cold, and for a moment I saw a side of him I'd never glimpsed before. "Philip has always had a grudge against me," he said, his voice low, controlled. "He's jealous, bitter, he's trying to tear us apart to ruin everything I've worked for, and you're letting him." I felt a pang of guilt, but I pushed on. "But is it true, Daniel? Are you hiding something?" His gaze hardened, and I felt a chill run through me. "Some things are better left buried, Elaine. Some truths do more harm than good." The words sent a shiver down my spine, and I realized, with a sinking feeling, that I would never get a straight answer from him. He was a man who thrived on secrets, who wore deception like a second skin. And I knew, in that moment, that I was truly alone. That evening, I confronted Philip once again, my heart pounding as I found him by the edge of the canal, gazing out over the water. "You were right," I said, my voice trembling. "He's hiding something, something dark." He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "And now you see, Elaine. Now you understand why I'm doing this." I took a deep breath, my mind racing. "But I can't be a part of this, Philip. Whatever revenge you're planning, whatever game you're playing, I can't do it." He smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "It's too late, Elaine. You're already part of it. You've been part of it from the beginning." I felt a surge of panic, realizing that there was no way out. I was trapped, caught between two men who saw me as nothing more than a pawn, a piece in a game I didn't understand. And as I looked out over the darkened canal, I realized that my life, my choices, had slipped beyond my control. There were forces at play here, forces far darker than I could have imagined. And all I could do was wait, helpless, as the shadows closed in around me.